But before we can understand how meiosis works, it'll first help to know a few terms that are related to chromosomes and the nucleus. So that's what we'll do next. Take a look at some terms. And so here's a cell, what we're going to again focus in on is how these chromosomes in the nucleus kind of arrange themselves during meiosis. And so to understand that, we'll kind of ignore everything else in the cell for now and just focus in on what's going on inside of the nucleus of the cell. You might remember that if you take a look at the nucleus, inside the nucleus you'll find the genetic material, DNA. And basically the DNA in eukaryotes, it's split up into several segments called chromosomes. Right? So each one of these gray things represents a chromosome. So chromosome, it's a separate piece of DNA. If you pull out a chromosome and take a look at what's on it, like this, you'll see that chromosomes contain kind of separate packets of information called genes. We'll see later that specifically what genes do is that they tell the cell how to make a particular type of protein. So a different gene will tell the cell how to make a different type of protein. But for now, how about if we just say that genes, what they do is that they're responsible for determining what particular trait a person is going to have. So for example, there is a gene somewhere on one of the chromosomes in your nucleus that determines what hair color you're going to have. Here's the deal. It turns out that we have more than one copy of each gene. So we're saying here that there's one gene on one of your chromosomes that determines what hair color you're going to have. Actually, it turns out that if you take a look at the rest of these chromosomes in the nucleus, there is another one in there that, if you take a look at it, also has a gene that determines what hair color you're going to have. Right? And so that's the case for every single gene, every single chromosome in the nucleus. If you take a look at another chromosome, say, it'll have a certain set of genes on there, but it turns out that there's another chromosome also in the nucleus that, if you take a look at it, has the same set of genes. Right? So every single chromosome, that's the case. You pull anyone out of the nucleus, it'll have a set of genes on there. There's always going to be another one in that same nucleus that has the same set. Right? So it turns out that there's a name given to these chromosomes that you're looking at here. So how about if we sum up what we just said in words? Turns out that sexually reproducing organisms, they have two copies of each chromosome, like we just showed you. Because they have two copies of each chromosome, that means that they have two copies of every gene, because each chromosome contains a certain set of genes. There's a name given to these chromosome pairs that you're looking at. And so these are all called homologous chromosomes. So homo means the same. And so homologous chromosomes, for example, this one and this one, are chromosomes from the same nucleus that have the same genes on them. Right? So you might be wondering, well, how did sexually reproducing organisms end up with two of every chromosome? In other words, how did a sexually reproducing organism, if you take a look at its cells, how can they have two of every single gene? Well, if you keep in mind how sexually reproducing organisms are made, that'll help answer this question. And so basically, whenever a sexually reproducing organism is made, that occurs whenever, again, a sperm fertilizes an egg. Basically, what a sperm contains is one of every single chromosome that's required to make a person. Right? And again, a sperm is made by the organism's father. The egg also contains one of every single chromosome that's necessary in order to make a person, right? Except that the egg was produced by the organism's mother. So whenever the sperm fertilizes an egg, basically this set of chromosomes is getting together with this set of chromosomes, so that the result is that now the cell here now has two of everything. And you might remember that what a fertilized egg is called, it's called a zygote. So again, zygotes, fertilized eggs, if you look at its nucleus, should have two of every single chromosome. In other words, zygotes are considered to be diploid. And whenever that egg is fertilized, that zygote ends up dividing and dividing and dividing many times until it eventually produces a baby. But again, if you take a look at the nucleus of all of these cells here, they all have 2 of every chromosome. So why do sexually reproducing organisms have 2 copies of every chromosome? It's because we get 1 copy of each chromosome from our mother and another copy of each chromosome from our dad. All right. So to relate that to this picture we've been working with, again, we have 2 of every chromosome. And the reason why that is because one set of chromosomes we inherit from our mother, and the other set of chromosomes we inherit from our father. Here's the deal though. So we have 2 of every chromosome, which means that we have 2 of every gene. Doesn't necessarily mean that the genes are the very same, are the exact same versions though. So here's what we mean by that. So because we have 2 parents, a mother and a father, that means that we have 2 genes that will determine what hair color we're going to have. Those 2 genes don't have to be the same version though. So for example, it's possible that our mother passed on to us the gene that tells us to have blonde hair, and our father passed on to us a version of the gene that also tells us to have blonde hair. So it's possible for both of our parents to give us the same version of a gene, for example, for hair color. But that's not always the case, right? It is entirely possible for a person to inherit the blonde hair gene from her mom, but from her father inherit the gene that determines hair color, but it tells her to have dark hair instead. Right, so what we're saying here is that when you take a look, when you consider homologous chromosomes, they have the same genes on them. So this and this, they're homologous because they both have the gene for hair color on it. But that gene for hair color doesn't have to be the same necessarily. It doesn't have to be the same version. So they may or may not be the same gene varieties. In other words, there's 2 genes for hair color, but one version says have blonde hair. The other version says have dark hair. Right? To use the official term, so they may or may not be the same gene varieties. In other words, they may or may not be the same allele. So allele just means a particular gene variety. So again, there is one gene here that determines hair color, but we're seeing that in this example there are 2 different versions. In other words, there's 2 different alleles for this gene. Right? So there's the blonde hair allele that determines what hair color you're going to have, and there's the dark hair allele for the hair color gene. Okay? So just some terms. And again, the goal of kind of defining all these terms is it'll help us understand what happens during meiosis.